Good evening, I'm Rory Fitzgerald, Professor of Practice in Survey Research from City University of London, and welcome to the seminar series tonight on behalf of NatCen Social Research, City University of London and the European Social Survey. Tonight's seminar is based on the crucial topic of interviewer behaviour. This feels slightly strange at a time when interviewers are generally not working in the field due to the pandemic, but in normal times, interviews are a crucial part of the survey process. They're known to get great response rates, far higher in many cases than self-completion methods, to help respondents to deal with difficult parts of surveys. But in recent years, we've become aware of an increasing amount of perhaps interviewer effects on the data, and that perhaps they're also a source of error as well as a source of a positive effect on the survey process. Tonight's seminar is based on improving or maximising positive effects of interviewer behaviour, and I'm delighted to welcome two of my colleagues from the European Social Survey who will be presenting this evening. Joost Kappelhof is Head of Methodology Department at the Leibniz Institute for Social Research, SCP, and he's a member of the core scientific team of the European Social Survey and co-work package leader of the work package on promoting desirable interviewer behaviour. His co-presenter tonight is Roberto Briceno-Rosas, a researcher at the Department of Survey Design and Methodology, GESIS in Germany, in Mannheim, also a member of the core scientific team and co-work package leader of our new work package on promoting desirable interviewer behaviour. At the end of the presentation, there'll be an opportunity to take questions, so please do put those in the question section. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Joost, who's going to start the presentation this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory, for that kind introduction. Before we start, Roberto, can you start the presentation? Thank you. I would also like to thank Rory and Stefan Swift and my other colleagues at the ESS headquarters at City University for this invitation to present on our work in the ESS, focusing on promoting desirable interviewer behavior in this ongoing webinar series. Just to be sure, if any of you are not familiar with the European Social Survey or the ESS, it is an international comparative survey set up to monitor social change in Europe. Next slide, Roberto, please. Yes. So today's talk will be structured in the following way. I will start with a little bit of background as to why the ESS decided to start this work package. I will then proceed to discuss the conceptual approach and the overall model driving this work package. Then I will continue with a more detailed description of the measures and procedures we implement in the ESS to promote desirable interviewer behavior. And we will also present some examples of our analysis approach. We would like to end our talk with room for discussion where we would like to discuss how we can take this work package even further, given the complex constraints posed by an international comparative survey. Next slide, Roberto. So to start with some background, our approach and our overall model. Next slide, please. So, interviewer behavior can have serious consequences for data quality, as it can increase the size of the different types of errors in all areas of the survey lifecycle in which interviewers are involved. Interviewers are, of course, involved in the recruitment and the selection of respondents, which can affect the estimated representativeness of the survey population. And in a face-to-face survey like the ESS, interviewers are, of course, responsible also for interviewing the respondents, and thus can also affect the measurement dimension or the measurement quality of the ESS data. Our ESS standards and procedures, as they are mentioned in the ESS specifications, they're aimed to reduce errors by defining or setting out guidelines, what we consider to be desirable interview behavior during data collection. And this work package, as Rory mentioned, aims to promote the adherence of interviewers to these standards and procedures. So the purpose of this new work package is a basically a reflection of our ongoing ambition to explore additional ways to promote desirable interviewer behavior within the ESS by preparing interviewers for data collection, monitor their behavior during fieldwork, and assess the implementation of the ESS standards, as well as the quality of the data produced by each interviewer. And this work aims to provide increased transparency for users of the ESS data by enabling us to identify and flag potential concerns regarding data quality. I think it's also important to stress again that this work continues to build on already a lot of work that has been done by other colleagues and former colleagues involved in the ESS. Our current work package team involves researchers from GESIS Mannheim in Germany, my own institute, the Netherlands Institute for Social Research in The Hague, and the colleagues from University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. Next slide, please, Roberto. Next slide, please. So the conceptual approach of the work package, is based on several insights, ideas that helped shape our overall model and analysis approach that I will explain using the following examples, clarifications. First of all, everyone tends to mostly think of fabrication or falsification of data in case of thinking of undesirable interviewer behavior. However, fabrication is not exactly the same as undesirable interviewer behavior. It is part of it, although fabrication can also be done by somebody else than the interviewer. Furthermore, interviewer effects are also not exactly the same as undesirable interviewer behavior. And although interviewer effects can increase as a result of undesirable interviewer behavior, they can never be fully mitigated in an interviewer-assisted survey. So they're all part of this concept we consider to be undesirable interviewer behavior. Secondly, our undesirable interviewer behavior or non-adherence to the standards or procedures we set out in the ESS, of course, can affect both the representation and the measurement dimension of this total survey error framework. For example, by deviating from contacting strategies, or by selecting the wrong person, by not fully reading out questions, and so forth. Thirdly, non-adherence can be intentional or unintentional. It can be avoidable, it can be non-avoidable, it can be justifiable or not justifiable. And I've given some examples here. For example, speeding, rushing through the interview, is undesirable interviewer behavior and should be avoided. But there are certain circumstances where one could see, or at least understand, why an interviewer would show that behavior, such as to avoid a break-off of the interview. Or interviewing the wrong person can be an unintentional error, but it can also be deliberate. Other aspects may be partly out of control of the interviewer, such as the way in which respondents adapt their answers or willingness to participate because of the gender, race, or perceived attractiveness of the interviewer. And so to be able to determine if undesirable interviewer behavior occurred and to be able to intervene, especially during the data collection stage, and to determine which of these underlying causes, intentional, unintentional, avoidable, unavoidable, which of these underlying causes brought about this observed undesirable interviewer behavior, that requires timely data and, of course, multiple indicators focusing on the different stages and aspects and dimensions that could be affected by this behavior. Another important part of our conceptual approach focuses on the idea that particular factors work differently in the way how they contribute to the likelihood of occurrence of undesirable interviewer behavior. So to this end, we make a distinction between factors that enable, factors that facilitate, and factors that accentuate undesirable interviewer behavior and its consequences. For example, enabling factors contribute to by enabling undesirable behavior, of course, and these can be quite broad, such as like moral stance of a person or structural characteristics of communication that generate this misunderstanding when asking questions. They can also be very specific, like the use of address or household sampling frames, which affords more responsibility to the interviewer in the selection process, or just the lack of knowledge about standards of interviewing. So these are all factors that enable basically undesirable interviewer behavior. Facilitating factors contribute to making undesirable interviewer behavior more likely to occur or less avoidable. For example, the lack of supervision of an interviewer or control over relating specific behavior to a specific explanatory variable is, of course, not without problems, and it's also possible to talk more about a combination of factors. Finally, factors that accentuate or contribute to promoting undesirable behavior or desirable behavior are those that drive or push the actions of an interviewer in a particular direction. For example, the type of or the level of the payment motivates interviewers to deviate or not from the rules and procedures that we want them to follow to a different degree. Can also be like, for example, the lack of post-data collection checks might help or accentuates interviewers be an accentuating factor in this. And last but not least, of course, in our conceptual approach, the policy. Basically, we see this as the fundamental pillars for effective and successful implementation of the strategy. For example, transparency, talking about these issues about interviewer behavior. We would like to have a country and also the core scientific team in the ESS that is transparent and forthcoming about these issues that they detect and how they deal with it and how we move forward, as well as be open about it to generate trust in the data quality. Next slide, please, Roberto. So our overall model is described here. It looks at ways in which we can promote desirable interviewer behavior or its impact on data quality in the various stages of the survey lifecycle. It focuses on actions we can take and indicators we can use at the planning and prevention stage, at the monitoring and detection stage, which is basically during the data collection phase of it, and of course the final stage, the assessment and evaluation of the data quality itself and the performances. As you can also see on the left-hand side, it focuses both on both dimensions of the total survey error by focusing for each stage on actions focused to increase the adherence to, for example, contacting and selection strategies with respect to the representation dimension, and focusing for each stage on actions to increase the adherence to standards and protocols during interviewing with respect basically to the measurement dimension. And also it is important to notice that the green line underneath resembles the feedback loop. The ESS work program cycle is set up it's 2 years, and it's set up in such a way that the beginning of the work program coincides with the end of basically survey round T, and the second half of the work program overlaps with that with the start of the survey round T+1. And basically this allows for a very effective feedback loop where we basically start with stage 3, so the assessment and evaluation of the survey round T, and use the information to inform the first 2 stages of basically the next survey round. Roberto, next slide, please. Now I would like to say a little bit about the actions and indicators we use to promote desirable interviewer behavior during the planning and prevention stage. So Roberto, if you can move 1 slide, please. And So for the planning and prevention stage, we focus on the country level on basically 4 aspects that can affect the undesirable interviewer behavior. And we try to minimize the factors that enable, facilitate, and accentuate undesirable interviewer behavior, as well as use indicators to inform us about the quality of the implementation of these aspects, given the ESS standards and procedures. So first of all, we look at the planned, basically interviewer workforce and the planned workload and the way interviewers are compensated for their work. Secondly, we look at the training and the briefing, including materials that they use. Thirdly, we look at the fieldwork planning and the projected number of interviews per week, given the number of active interviewers. Finally, we focus on expected issues and possible risks. And all of this is done in collaboration or discussion with the national coordinator teams that are basically responsible for the survey within a particular country. Roberto, next slide, please. So, for example, when we look during the preparatory stage at the workforce, we're looking at characteristics of the interviewer workforce, such as the number of interviewers they plan to use, how many will be active, as I mentioned before, what is their experience. Also, is the interviewer workforce well spread across the country? In case of multiple languages, we check if there are sufficient interviewers available for each language. With respect to the planned workforce, we assess whether or not many interviewers will be required to work on more than 48 sample units. The ESS specifications set 48 sample units as the upper limit, at least during the first phase of fieldwork, with the idea to reduce interviewer effects. We also determine if there are other related risks present that can contribute to the potential likelihood or increased likelihood of undesirable interviewer behavior, such as the absence of interviewer supervisors or receiving too many sampled cases at once. Finally, we look at the way interviewers are compensated. Is it in accordance with their responsibility? Is it competitive in terms of the labor market situation? Will it keep them motivated, basically? And with respect to the compensation, we want to ensure that interviewers are compensated in a way that matches the different type of tasks that they are required to complete. Basically, we want them for each task to be incentivized to adhere to that task-specific standard and procedure. And ideally, we want to find an optimal payment scheme to that end. So we want them to be paid for doing the selection stage, the final selection stage correctly in case of a household or address-based sample. We want them to complete the contact form data correctly, to have a good view of how the fieldwork went exactly. So we want them to be paid for all these different tasks. Next slide, please, Roberto. In the planning and prevention phase, we also focus on interviewer training and briefings. The countries are responsible for conducting the training and the ESS briefings, but of course have to meet the ESS standards and use the ESS materials. And we want to make sure that everyone uses the ESS source materials for this training and briefing, such as the interviewer manual, the practice interview, video clips, and we want to be sure that interviewers are informed about the quality monitoring efforts that will take place during this data collection. That will also include our extensive backcheck procedure that we will discuss later. We need them to agree that their interviewer ID will be used for monitoring purposes, which is in accordance with the GDPR. So we expect that this also will act as a sort of preventive signal with respect to avoiding undesirable interviewer behavior or promoting desirable interview behavior. Furthermore, we require a questionnaire for the evaluation of each briefing session to be completed. This questionnaire collects basically session-wide information on briefings, such as the date and the length of the briefing, the topics and materials that were used, as well as information regarding the trainees. All right. Next slide, please, Roberto. So, with respect to planning and other issues, we mainly focus on areas to detect possible factors that may increase the likelihood of undesirable interviewer behavior. For example, the relations between interviewers, fieldwork plans, and sample design. Are the fieldwork projections, the period, the estimated number of cases worked on every week, the number of expected interviewers per week, the number of active interviewers per week, are they realistic given the number of interviewers a country is planning to use? And given all of that, is the sample design practically implementable, or would it be better, for example, to decrease the number of PSUs, making the design potentially, less efficient in terms of the expected effective sample size, but maybe more realistic in terms of what the interviewer workforce can deliver? We also check for issues that can occur when working with the questionnaire itself. Are there long questions, filter questions, that if they're used result in skipping a large number of questions? Are there sections with long repetitive answering categories? And all these and other issues in the questionnaire can, of course, increase the likelihood of an interviewer deviating from the ESS interviewer standards and procedures. And if incentivized to do so, for example, by the way they are compensated. So if an interviewer is only compensated by completing interviews and not for other tasks, then he or she might be incentivized to rush through questionnaires. We also look in collaboration again with other work packages within the ESS for issues that can arise from translation or pre-testing that may help us to promote desirable interviewer behavior. And of course, finally, we want to take into account country-specific issues that can affect interviewer behavior, such as, as mentioned here, interviewer habits, the survey culture, and policies of the survey agency. And then next slide, Roberto, is basically where my colleague Roberto is gonna take over this presentation. I will go on mute and my video.
Thank you very much, Joost. So, so far, Joost has been able to present to you how we implement this in the preparation phase. So basically, how we prepare the best we can, the interviewers, ourselves, the team, the design for the specific country in order to promote desirable interviewer behavior. The next step would be, okay, we're going to the field and how we monitor the work that they are being done, and the sample that they are working and the interviews that they are achieving in order to detect any type of issue and, if possible, react and improve in a timely manner. So there are three areas that we work, elements that we look into when monitoring interviewer behavior. And the first is what we call contact forms data, which is basically the paradata on processing the sample, how the interviewers contact the sample units, the outcome of each contact attempt, etc. The second area is the interview data. So basically the result of the interview conducted by each interviewer. And lastly, the back checks is a measure that we take in the ESS in order to check, look back into one of the interviews or the cases that were worked by the interviewers in order to investigate, find, and check whether it was done correctly and it was actually an interview, and so on and so forth. It's a very effective measure as well in order to support the other two areas in providing new information of what we are collecting with the usual tools that we have and instruments. So in order to monitor the evolution of fieldwork and how we do it in the ESS, it's also very important to understand the complexity or the challenge that we have when monitoring fieldwork for multiple countries, and also the structure of the ESS. So what we have in the ESS is a structure where it's a semi-decentralized structure, you could say, where each national team hires a survey agency or conducts the fieldwork themselves if they are able to do it. And this allowed some variation, but it's very centralized in the standards that we're putting, and it's also very important for us as a central team to control and to check the quality of the data fieldwork. However, what this is the challenge that it brings is that we have to account for very different systems that are being used in each country. So even though the paradata that it's being used for contacting and selecting respondents is standardized in the input side, it is conducted in different CAPI systems, for example, recorded differently. So for the central team, the CST, to check in real time the outcome or the evolution of fieldwork, there has been an implementation very recently in the previous round of the fieldwork monitoring system, which basically allows and a central upload of all the data that is being collected in the countries on the sample units. And it is a subset, it is a reduced form of the paradata. It's not all the information that it's being collected and that it's being available for the public later in the integrated file that is published in the ESS website. But it includes enough information for us to look at elements, for example, like respondent response rates achieved by each interviewer, and also contact timing of the contacts, structure, distribution of contacts across different areas, and so on and so forth. We also have included a new element of the for controlling for selection procedures, which is also an important addition. But what I want to highlight here are two examples of how this varies and how this could help detect issues. So on the left, the first figure that we see is response rates by interview, and we see very different response rate. And when we have outliers in this area, it could help highlight cases that, or in the work being done by interviewers that we want or we suggest the national team to check in more detail. And on the left side, on the right side, sorry, we have graphs showing the amount of interviews conducted in one day, which is also an interesting element for detecting issues, either on the data that is being produced, on the paradata in this case, on the contact front data, or issues that, for example, we have been discussing, like fabrication or substitution and so on and so forth. Interesting, we have had cases where this type of information, which might seem for some people, surveys simple, can lead to finding out problems in the field that could be corrected, and that was the case in one of the countries, and it allowed in the last round and allowed us to correct that during the field and take the measures necessary. And it is interesting because you could say, well, it's not only one of the cases that we have is not only looking at poor performance, for example, but very good performance could also be an indicator of some issues happening. And not always the best interviewers are in the performance area are doing everything correctly. So that's why having this type of information will allow us, together with the survey agency or the national team, to find out the issues that might be happening, especially like non-responses and the use of the sample by the interviewers. The other area in the evolution of fieldwork is how the interviewing process it's happening. And for this, we have to look at the data that is being produced in each interview or by the interviewers. And for this, we have developed a tool. We want to at least 1/3 once 1/3 of the planned interviews are completed, to have a look at the data being produced. And in order to do this, because the data is being produced in each country, and in order to avoid any type of issues on retrieving that data and depositing it on a central server prior to actual data deposit, we have to consider the timely element here. So locally deposit data is the safest way to store the data during the fieldwork. We have developed a tool that allows the national teams to run a set of checks over the data that is saved locally, and check for indicators like time and speed of the interview, item on response, response pattern, and the interview impact on responses. And this is done together in collaboration also with the University of Ljubljana, which has done a lot of work on the front end of the tool. And it uses basically open source data analysis tools in order to conduct this analysis locally. I should also say that this is a special thanks to the colleagues in the KU Leuven, which have done a lot of work on what I will talk later on the assessment, but which also reveals that when we take that and the approach is taking this into the field, it allows us to check on time before doing the data collection any issue and trying to respond that. And by doing this, these are more standardized and more detailed analysis than might be done by some countries, and we could make sure that the same standards are being applied in all countries, being in the ESS, participants in the ESS. Some of I mentioned some of the indicators that we look at as timestamps. For example, we look at the duration of the interview, speed of the interview, timing of the interview in the day, so when were they conducted, and overlapping or proximity of interviews. These are very helpful informations that come from the use of timestamps. Looking at refusals, the amount of non-refusals, non-responses, no answers, or skipping patterns that are clustered within interviews. And also response variance, for example, near duplicates, straight lining, or variance in latent variables that are explained or partially or largely by the allocation within an interviewer. So just to show you an example of how this an output would look. So this shows the interval between consecutive interviews of the same interviewer and highlights cases that have been conducted, ended, and the next one started in less than 30 minutes, which is feasible in some cases, depending on the assignment of the cases within an interviewer. But it raises the flag when it becomes really small amount of time between one and the next interview, which allow us basically, by looking at the overall distribution and all the characteristics, to provide information on where to look, because that's the biggest issue in the field. Where do you look at? And you have very little time to do this. And this is what the tool helps do. It doesn't tell you what is happening. It allows you to pinpoint where you should be looking at in more detail. And this leads to the next step, because even though that we can have a look at the data, we don't know what is happening. One of the ways that we can solve this issue and know what is happening in more detail, is by conducting backticks. So that means going back to the respondent or the ineligible cases in the which are the specifications in the ESS, and checking whether the selection was correct, whether the interview was indeed conducted, whether showcards were used, whether laptop were actually used, the approximate length of the interview, and some other questions. And if you have other elements that are coming from the analysis of the interview data set, you can also look at in more detail on some responses. This should be conducted fairly quickly. after the outcome is, so whether it's an interview or it's an eligible, should be done in a fairly short amount of time to increase accuracy and timeliness in the response. And this also new is that these outcomes should be documented. So on a case level, so that it's possible to know and check, and later on the assessment, to know what happened on each case that was back-checked. Also, it's recommended that at a minimum of one respondent to be back-checked for each interviewer. This could be randomly selected, but in general, the general recommendation is that these are focus, if there are some issues or there are some interviewers that raise flags, that these are focus on those interviewers, and as we know, these backchecks are costly, so that the better focus, the more likely you will be able to understand or correct any issues. Finally, it's also recommended to use independent backcheck if possible. If you have a survey agency, this being conducted by a different instant. All right. So once the fieldwork ends, comes the phase where you want to assess, to look, review, and evaluate in more detail what has happened in that round. And as Joost mentioned at the beginning, to be able to feed back onto what happened and improve for the future round, as is the tradition in the ESS. There are two steps that we take for promoting desirable interviewer behavior and evaluating the interviewer behavior in a round. One is the inspection of cases for poor data quality prior to data release, and the second is the assessment of the impact of interviewer and to data quality. The first step, it has to do with being able to make the decisions on before you release the data, if there are any concerns on data quality, that it's after the data has been deposited. And this is done with help of the archive, which conducts several checks on the data and process the data. And then if it's required, our team conducts further analysis on those, like, for example, the duplicates. The approach that we use here is by looking at clustering of issues within interviewers and the comparison of flag cases with non-flag cases. So we compare interviewers and that have been flagged and those that have not been flagged, and that way we can see whether there are substantive difference. And so also thank Caroline van den Plas for her input on this and started this work previous rounds. Looking at, for example, timestamp, item non-response, and the correlation within interviewer variance. Similar to what we're doing within the field, but with a stronger focus on what makes those cases that are being flagged during data processing different from the rest. Finally, it's really the point after the data has been collected, it's usually too late. That's usually the problem. In order to it's too late to correct, but it's also usually too late to fully understand what happened. So in order to do this, we need the contextual information coming from fieldwork monitoring, and also the cooperation with the national teams and the survey agency, which helps us make informed decisions before data release. Once the data is released, or based on data that will be released, we conduct standardized quality assessments of interviewer behavior. This is a continuation of work that has been done in the past, and these are released on review of quality reviews, which focus on evaluating interviewer behavior, in this case for our work package, within and across countries. There are several areas that we want to assess: the recruitment and training of interviewers, their capacity, workload, how the briefings went, the fieldwork progress, as also interviewer capacity utilization, for example, where the interviewers distributed, the cases allocated, did they have enough interviewers? Also the interview process, like interview effects, how high they are, and draw conclusions and compare with previous rounds, and also the relation to other areas of expertise. That this allows us to also to discuss with the national teams and also with the funders in order to improve the future rounds. And they provide the necessary input for harmonize our activities, for example, through changes in the specifications for future rounds, so we can continue to keep the standards across all countries if necessary, and to make the changes for that. So one example of within country assessment is, for example, the comparison of interview effects. And here I provide an example of the round 9, where for this particular country, we see an increase on the interview effects, something that has changed compared to all the previous rounds where they participated. And this really raises the question why this happens. And this is the type of discussion that you want to have with the national team in order to improve and see what changed in this case. And across country, it allows us to provide an overview assessment. And in this case, as we see that these are the for the countries on the first data release for round 9, and we see a comparison of, for example, in this country compared to all the rest, and which suggestions we could make in order to decrease that compared to other countries, what makes this country different to the others, why is it in this case, for example, relative medium high interview effects for the items in the ESS round 9. So in order to move to the next slide, what we wanted to bring is to basically discuss some of the elements that we think are important and are open as well. I mean, not everything is fixed and ready. There are improvements and future developments that we have, and also open questions, or questions that we find challenging also for us to answer and that we want to bring for the discussion. One of the things is the evaluation of the effectiveness of the indicators. So there is a dilemma between, for example, hidden and uncovered issues. So there might be things that we could find if we use the indicators, but the issues that we might find doesn't mean, if we don't find anything, it doesn't mean that it's not there, or and this brings the dilemma to if it's an indicator that finds an issue. If, for example, I mentioned response rates and as one of the indicators that led us in previous rounds to pinpoint on a problem with an interview, does it mean that other sources or other indicators are not as good, or could they be other issues that we haven't found because we're not using or they're more complex and they need more detail or more adjusted or subtle indicators or combination of indicators to be able to find. So when we are assessing the quality of the indicator, I think it's also this is a very difficult element to discuss. Do we have enough? And it's always the point: have we found all the issues that could be found? Probably not. The other point is the ability to intervene in a timely manner. Some indicators could be very good or effective once you have a certain amount of cases allocated within an interviewer. But in the field, once you want to react as fast as possible, so having, for example, analysis of latent variables, it requires usually a large amount of cases. For example, a recommendation would be 15 cases per interviewer to conduct some kind of analysis, like principal component analysis on a battery. Then it might not be possible to find out if the number of interviews conducted by an interviewer are very low. Which usually it's also a recommendation in order to reduce the impact those interviewers have on the data. So this raises this kind of dilemmas where you might want to resource to some very basic interviewer indicators, but which are good for a timely manner, timely reaction. The next element is the sensitivity of the indicators. So we have the problem of different contexts, different countries. So the difference between standardization, adaptation, and country-specific indicators. We also are developing some further elements that we feel that are very important for our work package, like non-intrusive indicators of paradata, like the duplication of location of interviews, and also the changes of the focus in the CAPI system, in help with the University of Ljubljana. And these are technical elements that could help, forms of paradata could help improve our indicators and promoting interview behavior, desirable interview behavior. Finally, there is a further development of an index for interview risk, which uses the correlation between multiple indicators. Finally, we'd like to come to a conclusion with two thoughts. One is, what's the future of interviewers? And Rory already mentioned this at the beginning. And we have been discussing the idea of a shift in the weight of roles and tasks of the interviewers. For example, once we move to self-completion, then the importance of interviewers going to houses and recruiting interview respondents becomes more important than, for example, the conduction of an interview. Finally, we discussed how some of the part of our discussion is always trying to balance how much of the issues that we're finding are responsibility of the interviews and how much are caused by the respondents themselves. So we think that the lessons that we learn from this area of expertise and work is also very useful for work that could be will be conducted in surveys that have self-completion as a main source of their survey. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Roberto and Joost for a fascinating presentation. We already have some questions coming in. Perhaps if Roberto could ask you just to stop sharing your screen for one moment. And just to go to some of the questions. Just first of all, one comment from Malike Sark saying, thanks for the great and comprehensive presentation. So just to feed that back to both of you. And first of all, a comment really, and be interested to get your views on this from Muriel Cameron, talking about the key to getting good interviewer behaviour is training and briefing. And too often this area is not given enough focus. What's your reaction to the role of training and briefing? Which of course we've tried to improve in the ESS, but it looks like in round 9 those improvements maybe didn't lead to better quality.
Yes, yeah, should I?
You go ahead if you want to.
I would say that it's definitely one area that it seems very important. And I would say that it's a fundamental element that you want to have interviewers well trained, well briefed for the specific survey that you are conducting. That's why we put a lot of emphasis in the ESS on providing materials, providing recommendations of the to conduct the briefings and have interviewers well trained as a condition for them to be part of the ESS. It is usually a question of cost as well for the national teams and timing. So it is you want, for example, to have all face-to-face. That's the specification, the ESS face-to-face briefings for all interviewers. But it usually means organizing that meetings and or maybe interviewers traveling to a central location if necessary. You want to have good trainers as well, and one of the things that we have been putting a lot of emphasis recently is in the actual practice, which is basically what we find in the literature, that practice and the exercise on the specific questionnaire that you're going to conduct is a key element in reducing interview effects and also in allowing the interviewers to achieve the conductor task as smoothly as possible. And if this is done in a context that is supervised, then you can answer questions. Maybe you have an interviewer that is very experienced because has done a lot of work, but it doesn't mean that the work that has been done is a good work, or is the work that you want as with the standards for that specific survey. In our case, for example, standardized interviewing. And that's why you can correct that once you have personal briefings and so well supervised with good materials. And but again, it's a question also of cost. Are then funders putting also the money in there for this type of training? And I think it's very important to us to emphasize this.
Well, and I think if I can just add to that, of course, training and briefing are key, but also the fact that you want to reduce as much as possible factors that would, as I mentioned before, enable or facilitate undesirable interviewer behavior. So you want to have a payment structure in place that fits the task that they are required to do. You want them to know that they're being monitored. So I think you have to look at this from a more holistic point of view.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that one other point Muriel's made is the quality of who delivers the briefing is also paramount. It's interesting. I remember I've personally been in some very, very nice briefings that have gone very well, and a few in the past that went not so well. I think how the briefing gets started and the atmosphere is very important. Plus the practicalities like the room and the lunch and the remuneration, of course. An anonymous attendee has asked, is the interim dataset analysis tool compatible with the most commonly used analysis software like SPSS or Stata?
Yes, it is. It can read SPSS, Stata, SAS, CSV. So, yeah.
CS. I guess a related question to that is, would the tool be available to people outside of the ESS at some point in the future?
I don't know, Rory, what do you think?
Yeah.
I don't know. But I guess that makes it sound like there might be interest in using it beyond. So maybe we should have a think about that in the future. Question from Anouk Zabel. Hello, Anouk. Do you carry out back checks for case non-response in the ESS, e.g. non-interview due to refusal, non-contact, or only on completes? And if you do control case non-response, how is that done?
Well, we've had an interesting talk. I think it's important to separate the goal of the back checks with maybe issues like reissuing unsuccessful cases. Back checking a non-contact is particularly difficult because what do you have to do? You have to go back to somebody and ask whether or not it's true that they haven't been contacted and invited to be interviewed. So that is just, it's a very inefficient way to see and find out if interviewers are adhering to the standards and protocols. Of course, we look that's why we focus mainly on ineligibles and completed interviews. And if we find strange patterns in their contact behavior that might result in a large portion of refusals and non-contacts, of course, we focus on those interviewers to see if there's something wrong, or something that they're doing that is not what we want them to do. But focusing on back checking non-contacts is not the way we went.
Interesting. Another particularly cross-national questions come from Ivan Rimac. And he says, as the quality of interviewing depends on country surveying culture and the traditionally dominantly used fieldwork procedures, how is it possible to prepare internationally applicable indicators of quality control. Of course, that would not only apply to things like ESS, but also to other things like PIAC or PISA. How do you come up with cross-nationally, universally applicable kind of standards?
I think that goes to the heart of the whole ESS project. I mean, we set up standards for and procedures, of course, to make the data at the end as comparable as possible. And while, of course, also taking into account that there is on a national level or between countries variation possible. For example, a survey culture. So that is a difficult challenge. But what we're focusing here, of course, is also basically the level to which they not only can adhere as a result of national survey culture, but also the level they do adhere, even if it is possible. I hope that is.
Yeah, I would also like to add that I mean, if we look at indicators like interview effects, as been done, at the end it's in the ESS. At the end, you're looking at how much variance is being explained by the allocation of within an interviewer for specific items, and there are some general elements, and it's a fairly standard indicator that you can use in order to understand how much impact an interview has on the data that you're looking at. Of course, you have to consider what data are you looking at. Is it different from one survey to the other? You have to consider other elements if you want to look into more detail, like how the structure, the sample, how do they have a fully interpenetrated design, yes or no? So there is a complexity, of course, when you look into more detail. But I would say that it's the same for almost every indicator in survey methodology. We could say the same thing about response rates. I think it's a process. I would put it like this, and we in the ESS try to find as comparable as possible indicators to compare across countries in Europe, considering all of the other elements, and this is always the point, and also compare within a country. It's really these two elements playing at the same time that could help you or help the community in this case come up with indicators that are for interviewer behavior that are agreeable across countries and surveys, and yeah.
Thank you, Roberto. So we've got time for two more questions. The first one of which has really come from two commentators or two members of the audience today, both of whom you'll know, Lilia Domova and Inika Stoop, and it's about statistical offices. One of which, so, have you shared or will you be sharing your results with statistical offices? And also, if you do or have, do they seem surprised or provide explanations? Do they seem to have more depth interviewing information about what's going on at the national statistical level?
Well, we have shared some of our findings with the National Statistical Institute in ESS countries that where in that particular country, the National Statistical Institute was responsible for actually conducting the ESS survey in that country. I can't say that they were that surprised, I guess, in that sense. I think they were, despite even all the training and briefing and monitoring, it sometimes can prove very difficult to combat the national survey culture that they have to adhere to. And then if their monitoring is not up to the level that you would like to do, then I'm not sure that they are really surprised. I mean, they do, I think, acknowledge the fact that they have to do better and will do better.
Yeah, I would like to add, I think a point here is that, my impression is that there has been a push to a different approach to cases like falsification and accepting also issues of interviewing. Yeah. And it might be harder for a national institute, if there are issues, to accept those and to tackle them. But I think it is a process where we have to move from finding issues in interviewers it's a bad thing, but it's something that none of us wants to have. But that's why the transparency and the openness, it's a very important step in achieving better data. And this is part of what this work package wants to promote, and how we build our trust with the national teams in order to discuss this issue is part of the process. Usually we can say not funding an issue is an issue, because we usually there's always a bad apple, you could say, and it's about tackling that in an open way and trying to find solutions that are clear to the public how they were done on the data users.
In regard to Ineke Stoop's follow-up question, we do go back also to national survey agencies. I can't tell always, because usually that goes via the national coordinator team, whether or not the survey agencies act surprised. They, in general, they are open and willing, I guess, to intervene and deal with it. That's been my impression so far.
Thank you. And time for one last question. Do you consider environmental factors when you're looking at this, such as the presence of other people during the interview, or translators? Of course, we don't allow translators in ESS, but how about the presence of other people during the interview?
There are interviewer questionnaires at the end that basically record whether or not there was a third party presence. So that is something we do record. But in this presentation, in our analysis, I don't think we've explicitly taken that into account so far.
It has been, we do it at the end. So
at the end,
not doing the interview, not doing the monitoring. It is an issue that it has to do, of course, with training. It is a very hard issue to improve in some countries due to culture. Where do you do the interview? If you do it at home, how many people are, households, and so on and so forth. However, this is something that is addressed every round in the feedback loop, and we try to improve, and it has improved in many countries in the ESS if we compare to very early rounds.
Plus, I think it's also important to notice that the presence of a third party can be really influential with respect to one question and hardly has any impact with respect to the answer to another question. So that's another additional challenge we have to take into account.
I should say that the ESS data that is published in the ESS data, this information, and it's available to users if they want to control for it, for example, in their analysis.
Fantastic. Well, I'd like to thank both of our speakers for a wonderful presentation on a really important topic. And whatever happened, I mean, people have talked about the end of surveys. Well, surveys are still here, perhaps even more important at the moment in some cases with COVID. And I'm sure interviewers will continue to have a role of some sort, even if that changes a bit over time. So thank you very much, and really important work. This presentation will be available in due course on the website about the seminar series. So that will be posted soon. Just to give a kind of heads up of two others which are coming up. Very interesting one on the 5th of November, being run by the Gen Pop Web 2 group in the UK. Really looking at this, a crucial issue, perhaps if we don't have interviewers and we're writing and asking people to take part in a survey, how do you select someone in the household? Or perhaps you don't select someone, perhaps you ask everyone. But how do we resolve which of those is the best approach to take? So there'll be a really important seminar with Kristen Olsen, Patton Smith and Joel Williams, and chaired by Peter Lynn. So that's on the 5th of November. So please do sign up for that one. And on the 18th of November, we'll be looking at a webinar, Moving Household Financial Surveys Online. Again, perhaps a move away from interviewers to some extent. Some initial research findings from colleagues at the Office for National Statistics. Thanks again to our speakers, and thank you for joining us.